Draft physics video. So this I think will be a first in the series. Even though I've done other videos on the two slit, I just figure I'll try to keep things in groups and maybe make playlists for these different subjects. So this is on the two slit experiment and mostly, and just a summary of some of the arguments I've made in the past and what questions need to be answered. I don't think I'll argue extensively my own theory besides articulating it in a general sense that the phenomenons being created by the maze, the filter, that the light's being pushed through. So when you move the slits together, you create a change in the atmosphere that the light's going through. The atmosphere has more stuff in it, electrons and whatnot in a different configuration, and light's hitting that stuff and it is being changed in its direction by the stuff. Same argument might be able to be used for the phenomenon of refraction, in the sense that all surfaces would have this layer of electrons, even a piece of glass, and that the electrons would be in line with the surface. They would conform to it. And when you shine light through the electrons at different angles, the light reflects at different angles depending on the pressure of the electrons and the consistency of their arrangement. The more uneven the surface, the more uneven the electrons, and therefore more scatter, that kind of thing. But I'm not asserting that that's the truth. I'm just suggesting it could be among the many possible explanations that physics doesn't even wish to test in any overt way, because they're so confident this wave theory is correct. So the argument sort of starts with, maybe I'll magnify this image. So this is a double slit, image of a double slit that I did, and blow it up a little, and a pretty small slit with a little wire, pretty small wire as the middle impediment. And the pattern doesn't really do what they claim inside the envelope of the single slit. It's supposed to get pathetically weak, pathetically rapidly, and you can see it doesn't really get pathetically weak, pathetically rapidly. And one of the reasons why this laser beam experiments are so much different than the traditional two slit, where they developed the math and where they developed their understanding of the process. And in the traditional experiment, they send the light through an aperture before they send it to the double slit. And by doing that, they basically spread the light. They cause it to spread and diverge and create a single slit pattern, in a sense, Newton's rings, but not significant enough to disturb the experiment. But in a sense, it's coning the light before the light even gets to the double slit experiment. So the intensity isn't as even as with a laser beam, and so I think that's why a laser beam isn't consistent with traditional mathematics, in terms of it doesn't have the steep change because it's not coned light. Alright, so that's just one of the arguments of the many. I have pointed out before that the comparison of the double slit and the single slit, it's never really explained when they talk about these experiments, that the single slit creates exactly the same pattern. There's really no need to be thinking about photons going through both slits and all of that, because we already know the single slit without two photons, without two opportunities to create two waves, creates the same pattern, pretty much the same. The only difference between, I have an image of a single slit. The only difference between the single slit and the double slit are these little lines you see. Hopefully you see. I have to figure out, the mouse never seems to be exactly where it should be on the image. So these little lines aren't present in the single slit pattern. So it's basically the same pattern except without the little lines. of the two that I performed. So yeah, they never accurately describe the circumstance and create, in a sense, a need or an intuitive will to say, well, how does it create the pattern? It must go through both slits. And so they start this idea of creating two waves. And if they use the same theory they use in the single slit experiment to explain the interference pattern, which is Huygens, which is the light breaks into essentially two functional beams, and those beams now radiate waves, rounded waves that interfere with each other. If they consistently applied that theory to the double slit experiment, then you'd end up with, you know, 4 waves interfering instead of 2. But regardless, so yeah, the whole experiment isn't treated very scientifically, in my opinion. That's, I think, obvious. The analogies to water waves are clearly just described in kind of a prejudicial way, showing a lot of bias in the sense they show comparisons that match, like the double slit, and the match isn't really realistically a match, in the sense that the water wave experiment creates a double high and a double low, which is a double minus. So in a light and dark experiment, it would mean that it's double dark somehow. You know, nothing, light can't do that, clearly. And the pattern would be cycling between double on, twice as much light, and negative 2 amount of light. And it would be cycling between those two in these different patterns. And clearly that doesn't happen with photons, so the similarity breaks down pretty quickly as a hard analogy. And the more you poke at it, in the terms of you recognize that water waves don't create this kind of elaborate pattern in a single aperture, it doesn't create the same interference pattern, and at best it creates a weak diffraction pattern, where you know, they'll get some interference with the actual mechanics of the water going through the slit, which creates friction, which pulls the waves to the side and can create a splitting of the energy, because it's basically, you know, some of the water's going fast through the middle and some's going much slower on the edges because of friction. So the analogies are really poor, yet they use them extensively and claim that anytime you see this pattern, it must be interference, and that it can't be caused by any other known phenomenon in the universe, kind of a thing. And that's just kind of propaganda. It's not scientifically true. It's not accurate. It's not being true to the evidence. It's clearly just a kind of distortion, because they kind of believe this to be true, and they'll surround themselves with the supporting evidence and basically ignore any evidence that indicates that might not be the right answer, because there's an inconsistency, or worse, a complete paradox, which I would claim things like Huygens creates, mechanisms for which there's just no evidence that it happens that way. Alright, so another point I've made previously is that this pattern doesn't match the mathematics, in the sense that you can't see it perfectly here. It's hard to photograph completely accurately, or what you see with your eyes, what you can see, what details you can resolve, but there's clearly no substantial gradation. So the pattern mathematically is supposed to gradually rise and gradually fall in a very even wave-like way, and the pattern doesn't look like that. It looks very bar. It looks very consistent in terms of the lights are relatively the same brightnesses, and the darks are substantially all dark, and there's not too much gradation in the pattern. Nothing like what the math says should happen if it was truly doing something wave-like. So it's another hard inconsistency, indicating that this pattern that looks very on-off, like there is a pattern, there's no pattern, pattern, no pattern. You know, they're kind of inaccurately describing it. All right, a thing that was quite interesting. Let's see if I can go to the video for this part. I mean, where you can get some detail. Is this one maybe? We'll see. Yeah, it looks like the video. Alright, so you can see a bunch of scatter lines, you know, a bunch of noise in the signal. So this is the video didn't turn out very well, so I wasn't going to substantially use it. But the horizontal lines I thought were kind of interesting. I might be able to make this bigger without messing things up too much. Let's see. Sorry, I'm still learning. Yeah, no, you can't really do that. That doesn't exactly work. Okay. Didn't think I'd get away with it, but I thought I'd give it a shot anyway. I could probably make it a little bigger. A little bigger there. So anyway, alright, so you know, you can't see it terribly well, but there's a bunch of, so the slit is taller than it is wide by huge, substantial proportions. But you're also, the laser beam diverges, and it doesn't diverge like the 99%, well, 95% of the light, say, goes very in a narrow beam, and then there's 5% that's like a halo or a residue. And that's what you're sort of seeing here, is that residue is diffracting off the upper edges of the slit. So even though the slit's probably a ½ inch long, there's still enough light from the laser that's reaching the upper edges to be bent also in the same way. And the interesting fact is it seems very reciprocal. That is, it seems upside down and reversed. So it's switched left to right and vertical to upside down. So patterns like this are duplicated on the other side exactly. So you can sort of see that there's a line out here, and that matches this line out here, if the mouse is doing this correctly, hopefully. So that you can find definite pattern matches. So the two patterns are the same and they're reversed, which I don't know what it exactly means, but it's interesting. This little spot in the middle is just a black spot I put on the paper to dull down the intensity of the center of the beam, which is curious. That, you know, it might work better for photographing if I do it on a black surface next time, so I might think of doing that. But here you can sort of see the very boxy look to the spots, and that's what they really did look like. And you can also see here the pattern much better, probably, that the patterns are very similar. Like there's stuff to here to the right, stuff to the left over here, very symmetrical and reversed. Yeah, and I don't know if there's anything else stunning. That's just my black spot. You can really see the lines there a little better. You can see how they're kind of just blobs of light. There's no intensity in the center of these little blobs at all. They seem very flat in terms of the amount of light in each one, and they should be bright in the center and then fade to dark. And they're not doing that, clearly. Alright, so I have probably enough for that piece of video. So that's video of the double slit. The other thing I did notice, I'll just comment on it since I did notice it. When I was doing the experiment, I moved the beam into the slit and then out of the slit. And the slit had an unevenness. One side was a little bit wider than the other side on the side of the wire, and you could actually create a pattern that was much bigger, and then as you went across it got much smaller when you went over both slits, and then when you went the other side it was all a small pattern. So indicating that to some extent the two slits are creating two patterns. that are superimposing on each other. It's a kind of an indication. I wouldn't jump to any conclusions, but I'm just saying it's curious that you can get lots of different effects by changing the angle that the light comes through, and what exactly what exposure you have to the slit. By angling the surface of the thing you're shooting it at, you can change how narrow the slit is and how wide the slit is, things like that. And you get quite a bit of variation in the pattern, but I'll try to find a better way to videotape that where you get a little better resolution. So anyway, alright, and so in the math, the basic argument is yes, you have these fundamental factors, how wide the slit is. Now, the funny part is when they do the double slit math, in the shorthand version anyway, the version used 99.9% of the time, the width of the slit isn't even in the math. All they care about is the width of the center impediment. And it clearly matters, the width of the slit. I would argue that that's why you see these little lines, is because the width of the slit is still substantially narrow. Well, it's wide enough to create a pattern, but not too narrow to force everything very small, obviously. So I guess in a sense it's a wide opening with a wire. Yeah, so so that's just another, what's that about? Somehow they don't think the outside surfaces are creating any part of the pattern, when of course they must be. So the math is just the width of the slit, the wavelength of the light, the width of the impediment in the double slit experiment, and the distance to the target, and some assumptions about the light coming in. And the key factor is just this thing called sine theta, which is this engineered math to decide what the angle is. And they just name these locations. So this, in the single slit, they start with a 0 for the center, and then go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in the double slit, they count the middle thing as 1, and then this is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And how far the pattern should be, or where you could calculate the pattern to be, would just be basically you're just saying, I want to know how far away from the center this number 2 is, and so then you just multiply 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times this sine theta angle, which is just really the same argument I've made, that if you hit one electron and move 3 degrees, and then you hit 2 electrons and move 3 more degrees, that would be 6 degrees, and hit one more electron and move 9 degrees, it would create the same numerical proportions. So you'd end up with exactly the same result in terms of your math. Now, how accurate that math is going to be as a generalization, it might give you a location, but I think with each experiment done with different materials and different slit materials, you're probably going to get some change and difference in where it mathematically lands. So I think the formula doesn't have enough variables, and it's incomplete. It's like Newton's gravity formula. It's not quite the whole story. But it's just more evidence that they've settled for very generalistic kind of mathematics and claimed that it's highly accurate when it's not highly accurate. And it's just a generalization, and so it's another part of this kind of just propaganda selling the idea that this experiment shows more than it really does. It proves nothing in terms of certainly it can be used as evidence of something, but whether this experiment could prove anything absolutely, I mean, I guess you can sort of use it to prove that there's the light is being inverted, that the light that goes through the top of the slit ends up at the bottom, and the light at the bottom ends up at the top, or something like that is happening. Some of that's indicatable. The fact that all these images have a sort of roundness to their shape, an oblong, sort of indicates the shape of the laser beam. So there's certain pieces of evidence that probably can be gleaned to be evidence, of certain things making a difference. Also understand by quantum mechanical theory, it's basically their theory that it doesn't matter where the photon goes in to the two slits or the single slit, next to the surface or right dead in the middle, their probability mass is the same for all photons. Where I think you can kind of sensibly say that probably doesn't sound right, but that's all you can say, is it doesn't sound quite right. And that a more sensible explanation for what's happening is if that a probability is being created, a probability of an outcome, that is light going all the way to that 5th or 6th bar, that's probably something that happens when the photon encounters the obstacle, and that it's probably the light that was near the surface of the slit that ends up out on these fringes, and the light going through the middle that ends up in that bright spot in the middle. And that's where your probability is created by merely calculating the nuances of the material you're shooting the light through, and the fact that there would logically or sensibly, you could imagine there could be a difference between the physics of being in between two objects and being right next to an object. I mean, as we know from nuclear physics, how atoms work and how electrons and protons work, proximity matters. And clearly the big picture gravity model also gives you some indication that it matters. And to not even talk about, like I said, they won't even have that conversation. It's just nowhere in the physics. It's not even considered that it's possible that they have fundamentally misunderstood this experiment. They are so convinced on what I would argue is just circumstantial evidence. It just looks like, or it seems like, and when you look at the evidence honestly, all of those looks likes and seems likes breaks down, as I stated, because the evidence is it doesn't look like the single slit in water, and it doesn't look like the multi-slit in water. There's lots of inconsistencies, lots of reasons to think it's not the same phenomenon, it's some fundamentally different phenomenon. Alright, so we'll switch the image to, so this is the double slit pattern. I should have the single slit here also. There it is. Enlarge that a little. So you can see no bars are present, but generally speaking the pattern is very similar, and I would say the central maximum is a little smaller. So like I said, in the two experiments mathematically this is considered a 0, and in the double slit it's considered 1, and so that's what changes the amount of how far away you get based on how wide your slit is and what wavelength light you're using. So you can also see the pattern. Again, you can sort of see it in the diffracted pattern. So this pattern is essentially being diffracted a second time at the top surfaces and diverging again in the same kind of way in these stripes from the top and bottom slit. And you can kind of see that they really don't have any gradation in intensity. There either is kind of some light and there's no light, but there's not a lot of gradation. Some, but not a lot. Let's see, I think I have another image on here of the, well, this is the actual razor blades, which is pretty cool. So they're really old razors, and so this was the single slit, and so these are rust blobs on here. But anyway, but the metal is pretty much intact. But anyway, the beveled edges are less than a millimeter. I'd say they're probably a ½ millimeter. And so this slit opening has to be like 1/20th or 1/15th of a millimeter, I would guess, was the slit opening that created this pattern. Yeah, this pattern. Yeah. Okay, so so I also reference website. So let me pop that up here. Because I did write an article a while ago pointing out some of this on just the two slit experiments. So I'll leave a link below to this page. Now, it hasn't been updated in over a year or two, but it's basically just talks about the fact that the evidence for how they describe the single slit versus the two slit, the fact that it doesn't really work out in water. Now, I would add to this also the fact that the pattern isn't as gradient as it should be in photons, light photons. It does come out that way with electrons, and as I've previously explained, that's likely because electrons repel each other. They don't actually hit each other, so they deflect off of each other, and their deflection is going to be based on how close they come to each other, so they're more likely to have a gradation. Where photons, as most physics understands, I think most physics people believe that a photon either hits an electron or it does not hit it, but it does not go by an electron and create a disturbance. Photons have to give away all their energy or none of their energy, but they don't do the I went by you and created an effect that didn't require any extra energy, that didn't steal any from me. Photons can't give away anything. They can't give away their speed, they can't give away their mass, they can't give away any portion of themselves. So they either interact fully or they don't. Where electrons can, because there's force between them, the forces can, like gravity, they can bounce off of each other essentially without hitting each other. And so that's another clear piece of evidence indicating such a huge difference in theory here of what's happening. Quantum mechanics would have you believe that electrons don't have a certain position in space, that they're doing a probability mathematics of some kind, and when they encounter a slit, it doesn't matter where they go in, they just somehow automatically are now probabilistic, and that they will have a probabilistic encounter with each other, themselves technically. They'll have a probabilistic encounter with copies of themselves, some sort of copy, imaginary copy, multi-dimensional copy, multi-universe copies, whatever, it doesn't matter, and calculate their probability of landing in a certain position. Where I would argue the more sensible argument is that, again, the structure has structure, and the structure is probably electrons, and that the electrons are actually bouncing, being deflected by the electrons they're encountering, which is creating a much smoother pattern. Yeah, probably more than you need to know. So I think there's a couple of images on here. So this needs to have added to it that the pattern isn't correct, that the mathematics is really just relying on one simple the sine theta is really the whole, that's everything in the math. That's the piece that has all of the huge interpretations. That's the quantum mechanical bit, is the sine theta. Everything else is just basic structure that you have to, obviously it makes a difference how wide the slit is, and obviously it makes a difference what the wavelength of the light is, because that's going to change how much, in my theory, an electron would move. So so here's the headline. It's about the surfaces, not the slits. I should probably say it's about the surfaces, not the photons. The photons are just dumb little simple things. They don't have radar, they don't access the multiverse, they don't read our minds, they don't do any of that kind of stuff. And it's the physical experiment where the electrons and the atoms are. That's the thing that's complicated, and that's the thing creating the effect. And that's the simple argument. I certainly have gone into some detail regarding some of how that structure might be. It's not on this page yet, but that's where I will be adding some argument to the fact that this simple counter explanation is. But this page is mostly for the purpose of just explaining how there's good reason to have this conversation. And the fact that they've closed the conversation, you can't have the conversation. They won't allow the conversation. It's just a closed subject, is just fundamentally wrong. It's a mistake for physics to have that attitude. They should be accountable. They should be forced to deal with these inconsistencies, with these quandaries, with these paradoxes. They should have to deal with the fact that their proposed theories have no mechanical evidence for the structure they're claiming to exist. Like, it's much like dark matter in the cosmos. They have Huygens in the small universe, and they have absolutely no physical evidence that photons do any such thing as create little waves in front of them or any of this stuff. There's no accounting for the energy that would be required, no accounting for the processing that has to take place. They're claiming photons are doing all this processing. Processing is essentially energy. You have to account where it came from, and there's no accounting. So this image is a simple image of just putting your fingers together in front of a good light source, like the white on a screen, and you'll actually see light disappear, in the sense that you can't see the light between my two fingers. And there's a reason that's happening. And it's not because the photons are saying, well, we're right here, right between the two fingers, and we're going to sit there and somehow now we have a probabilistic problem. So right to the left or right of the two fingers, there's no, photons don't have any problem. How come it's a problem just right there, where the two surfaces are in closest contact? Why is that where the problem is? And why is that the part that's gotten dark? And the reason it's gotten dark is because the light has diverged, so it's going somewhere else. It's missing my eye because it's hitting my eyebrow, or it's hitting the top of my head, or it's going right over my head, or it's hitting me somewhere lower. But it's not going to my eye as it should be, because it's hit electrons between my two fingers and they've bent the path of the light. Alright, so yeah, so this needs to have some add-ons and, you know, to be made more complete, but it's not badly written. I saw it, I read it, I said, hey, that's not terrible. So anyway, just pointing out water waves as comparison. I was just pointing out how it's really not a very good comparison. And so I mean, there's much more to this subject than physics has allowed there to be, and again, they describe this as nail in the coffin evidence, that this image is nail in the coffin evidence that, well, this isn't the image, so let me jump back to the image. I guess either one of these will do, I would think. Yeah, that this image is nail in the coffin evidence that light is a wave. And I don't think it's anywhere near nail in the coffin evidence of anything. Again, understand the context. Newton discovered Newton's rings. That is, he discovered the fact that light spreads when it encounters a small hole, small aperture, 150 years before Young came along and did the double slit experiment and found this pattern. Now, this pattern is just Newton's rings, where you just cut off the top and the bottom. You know, you're not doing the circle. If you did the circle, these would be rings. So, you know, and you know, that's just the truth of it. And so, you know, it's the same phenomenon as Newton's rings, and you're just seeing it in a piece of the dimension cut out, just in one dimension. But it's exactly the same phenomenon. Now, everybody thinks Young is a startling discovery, when there really wasn't anything startling. And more curious is the fact that it was well after Young that they discovered that the two-slit pattern is actually creating two patterns, that the envelope of the single slit is containing the double slit. Let me see if I can go to that image. The one with the little lines in it again. There we go. Make it bigger, and it should work. So, in essence, the single slit is these big blobs, and the double slit is the thing adding the little lines in between. And I did notice they all had the same number, which is a little curious, because in the traditional mathematics, the number decreases, you know, with each migration to the right or left, and the number isn't decreasing. It's the only thing increasing is the number of black spaces. So the number of bars is the same, and the illusion is that there's fewer bars later on, but there really isn't. There's more black space. So it's another reason to say, to cast serious doubt on the mathematics, because the number of the amount of black space is increasing. So the actual number of bars is exactly the same, just the amount of black space is increasing. Alright, so I think that's enough for a first installment. So hopefully we'll do some more experiments and have further updates on what I observe, and I'll attempt to make a video explaining what I think the mechanism is. The basic theory, like I said, you have to go through a lot of modeling to figure out exactly what the electrons are doing. It's clearly a charged circumstance for the electrons, having two surfaces that are connected. That is, they're usually metal. They're usually going to be connected in some way or another. So, you know, whether or not they create opposite charges and stuff, this is all questions that need to be asked. I tend to doubt it. But the real truth is that when you bring two surfaces together, whatever electrons are on the surface are clearly going to repel each other, and they're going to move out off the surface. So as the surfaces come together, the electrons will tend to push to the end of the surface, out away from the surface if there's free space, and tend to bulge around those two outside edges. So, because then they can stay further apart. You know, they don't have to get too close to each other. Something like that. But they can't get too far away from the protons that they're really feeling. So that's the reason why they're on the surface, is because they're attracted to the photons weakly. And they can't get too far away, because then they will lose that weak attraction. So somewhere in that balance creates a field of electrons that the photons are hitting. And as I state, you can sort of just do the math, their math, by just saying, instead of a sine theta created by a wave function, you just create the sine theta, that is the angle, by recognizing the relationship between the frequency of the light, which will dictate how much the electron moves, and at what angle it will release the new photon. And it's probably a new photon. You know, the higher the frequency would change the width of the spread, how much it spreads, and the lower the frequency, the more spread, that kind of thing. The wider the divergence. And so mathematically you can do the same thing, and you just go by based on the number of electrons it hits. So if it hits 1 electron, it moves 3 degrees, 2 electrons 6 degrees, 3 electrons 9 degrees. It could be 2.5 degrees, it could be 1.5 degrees, depending on the wavelength of the light and the width of the slit, and how much pressure the electrons are under. Alright, so I think that's what needs to be added. So I'll do a video adding more about that in the future. So anyway, I think that's about said it. So I mean, this is a foundational experiment in quantum mechanics, and I just don't know how anybody can argue that it has been misrepresented, inaccurately described, and there's a ton of information in this experiment that's not accounted for. The details aren't explored. The experiment isn't tested and retested in different ways to see if some other truth can be gleaned besides any evidence that verifies wave theory. There's absolutely no will or activity exercised on testing it, you know, trying to disprove their own theory. So one of the things a scientist should do, which is find evidence saying it isn't the way you think it is, they're overtly demonstrating no will to do, to explain these details and explain how magical multiverses or photon radar is a satisfactory explanation. It's really bad science, and I think every reasonable person should be able to say it's not done well enough. Way too many conclusions were jumped to way too fast, and yes, it was done in the early 1900s, throughout the 1800s, this war about particle versus wave, and there was so much energy invested in it, and they were so, the etherists really wanted it to be a wave universe, and they forced it. There's clear evidence that it looks like forced evidence. It's a forced conclusion, and that's no better than propaganda, and science should be above that. And yeah, so that's enough, I think. So till next time and such.